of sin when He found me and brought me in to the potter's house, so different from the sand. There He placed me upon the wheels, and He fashions me as He wills. I'm just clay in the potter's hands. I'm just clay in the potter's hands, lifted up from the miry sands. May He form me to His demands. I'm just clay in the potter's hands. Someday soon I will be complete, the potter face to face I'll meet, in whose image I'll be conformed in that land. But for now all is peace and rest, for the potter, he knows what's best. I'm just clay in the potter's hands. I'm just clay in the potter's hands, lifted up from the miry sands. May He form me to His demands. I'm just clay in the potter's hands. I'm just clay. I'm just clay. I'm just clay in the potter's hands.
Matthew chapter number 9. Once you find your place, if you would, stand with us in honor of the reading of the Scriptures. Let me say this again. If you're visiting with us this morning, it is a great honor to have you in the house of the Lord today. And we don't take it lightly, especially in the day and hour we live. People are afraid to go out. People are concerned about some things, and that's fine, well and good. But it's a great honor to have you here this morning, and thank you so very much. Home folk, we're honored to see you. We're glad that you're here and back in the house of the Lord today. Matthew chapter number 9, I'm going to read 2 verses this morning, and then we will make our prayer, and I'll try my best to preach with the right spirit what the Lord's placed upon my heart this morning. The Bible says in verse number 35 of Matthew chapter number 9, "And Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every sickness and every disease among the people. But when He saw the multitudes, He was moved with compassion on them, because they fainted and were scattered abroad as sheep having no shepherd." I want to draw your attention to that phrase, as sheep having no shepherd. Thank you for standing this morning. You can be seated. I've been thinking about, of course there's no way that you can help but think about this. I've been thinking about the unrest in our nation. And there's a lot of words you can describe to say. You can put a lot of things in it. And listen, I'm not trying to preach a social gospel this morning. That's not it whatsoever. But our nation, as I mentioned before about the need of revival, our nation is in a state of unrest. We've been divided. We've been splintered. We've been told what to think. We've been told how to respond. And I begin to think about our nation being at unrest. And, we've been impacted for the last little over 2 months now with the virus, with the news of the virus and the effects of this virus. We've had to deal with a change in society, how we do things. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know to the sense of normalcy that it'll ever go back to. I just don't know. There's a lot of uncertainties. I never thought I'd ever see the day. Years ago, you were told you couldn't go to the movies with a mask on. Now, if you go anywhere, you got to have a mask on. And I don't know what it's going to be in the future. I never thought I would ever see a day that in our country they would filter you into stores like they do in an amusement park ride, allowing certain in and certain out. I just never thought I'd ever see that in our country. And I know some of that they're trying to take precautions. They're trying to be safe. But anyway, that being said, it has changed our lifestyle. I mentioned our young people. I hate that our young people. My son missed his senior graduation in college. He graduated with his bachelor's degree, and he's going to get a walk, but it's going to be in the fall. Our high school graduates, they missed out on that's a monumental life moment. That's a monumental life moment. They've worked 12, 13 years, maybe some of them 14, 15 years, I don't know. They worked a long time to get to that place. And because of all the circumstances that were out of their control, our society changed all that. And then we turn our attention to what's going on in the news today. You turn your attention to the loss and to the fear mongering, everything that's been promoted today, and our nation's in a mess. I think about all of our attention turned to the tragedy in Minneapolis, and it is a tragedy. Man lost his life. It's a tragedy. I'm not here to justify. I'm not here to do all those things. I'm not here to try to explain it away. Bottom line is a man lost his life, and that's a tragedy. And so our mind is turning that, and our country is seeing one more time. This is not new. This is not the first time this has happened. But our country is seeing one more time the lawlessness and the wickedness and ultimately the depravity of sinful man. Now you can call it what you want. Well, you can call it what you want to call it. But what's going on in our nation from the actions of that police officer, by the way, I don't believe that's all of our police force. I do not believe that the actions of one or four men sum up the actions of the entire people who have sworn to protect and serve our great nation. And we need to be aware of that fact, and we need to understand that we need to deal with this as an individual basis, not as a blanket statement over every law enforcement, over every public servant. Okay, so I think we need to be well aware of this fact this morning. And most people with normal thinking are aware of that. You said, preacher, I don't like police officers. They give me speeding tickets. Stop speeding. Stop speeding. If you don't want to get a speeding ticket, don't speed. Now listen, I know I'm preaching to the choir this morning, but stop speeding. You can't blame them for trying to uphold a law that they were sworn to uphold. Now, that being said, there is no excuse for what's going on in our nation. The looting and the damage and the hatred and the violence and the burning and the destruction and the rioting. Let me tell you something. That's not the way that the First Amendment protects from. Now, don't misunderstand that. This is not a political message. I promise you this, but it's building up to what something I think is very vital that we see. I do not believe that we live in a day where the police ought to have their hands tied. I don't believe that. I do not believe that. I believe that policeman has a right to go home to his wife and children. And if someone, listen, red, yellow, black, and white, it matters not to me. If someone threatens that policeman's life, I believe he ought to be able to defend himself and uphold the law and go home to his family. I believe he ought to protect the businesses of that neighborhood that they're burning down. I believe he ought to be able to do that. Now, when I say protect them, you're going to shut me off. Don't turn me off. Listen, let me get through the message. But I believe they ought to be able to use whatever force is necessary to meet force with force. Are you listening to me? I'm not talking about they ought to spray a little tear gas and hope for the best. Y'all still okay? Okay, now stay with me because I'm going somewhere. But at the same time, when we look at the depravity of man, you know what we're faced with? We're faced with our emotions. Now let me tell you about me for just a moment. Because I can't speak for you. I don't know what it does to you, but I know what it does to me. We're back in the foyer. These blessed men that God has placed here to be an encouragement to their pastor. I was so mad before I walked down the aisle. I thought this was not going to be. I really wasn't mad. But let me tell you what happens. When I begin to think about these things that happen, it makes me angry. It makes me angry. It makes me angry that a law enforcement officer would be so foolish. It makes me angry to know that in the day and hour that we live in, what he did was wrong and wicked in and of itself. But to know that somebody is watching you. To know that somebody's going to put that on video. And to know, number one, you're wicked and got problems, and number two, you're no more accountable. That makes me angry. Because let me tell you what it does. It puts those that wear the badge and those that defend our country, it puts those at risk because of their foolishness. It puts a bad light in our society. And I believe the finger should be pointed back not to just that one, but to those four. I don't know what went on. I don't know the whole story. You don't know the whole story. We'll probably never know the whole story. But I know enough about the story to know that I believe he took it a little overboard. I believe he took it a little overboard. Now, again, that does not say lawlessness. But when I see somebody that's traveling from city to city to destroy a city, that they're busing them in to destroy a city that they don't live in, that makes me angry. That bothers me. That matter of fact, it makes me a little more angry. It infuriates me. It infuriates me that none of this happened in Charlotte. This didn't happen in Raleigh. They were telling me that they blocked I-40 in Greensboro yesterday. Say, preacher, what does it make you want to do? Ask me after service. But I'm telling you, we're seeing the depravity of man that are looking for an excuse to unleash the wickedness of their hearts. And the last time you've looked at your own self, it don't take much of an excuse that we need to unleash the wickedness of our hearts. But it makes me angry. It bothers me. It troubles me that they're looking to cause trouble, destroy our country. Man, these are the two things that's bombarding our news, isn't it? My response is oftentimes blunt, and my response can oftentimes become uncompassionate. It's hard to be compassionate. I didn't say I was just in what I'm saying, but it's hard to be compassionate when somebody is acting so foolish and bringing things upon themselves. It's hard for me to feel compassion when they're going to bring that police officer up on charges. It's hard for me to feel compassion about that. But it's also hard for me to feel compassion that a law enforcement officer would defend himself from somebody that's trying to take his life and hurt him because of the color of his skin or because of the badge that he's wearing. Can I preach on my pop crate for a minute? Racism comes in all colors. Racism comes in all colors. Racism is also promoted and blown up in a lot of fashions. It's the fire is flame. Now, I need to get back to preaching because here's what I'm saying. It affects me. The way you're nodding, the way you're looking at me, and the way you're saying amen, it affects you. It affects you. It affects our communities. It affects our society. It affects our country. It affects the country in which we are raising our children and our grandchildren to live in. It affects you. It affects you. By the way, let me give you one more. I think it's a disgrace that our elected officials, those who have been elected into a city or into a town, to better that town, to seek the protection of that town, to seek the promotion of that town, it is a disgrace for those elected individuals to march with a crowd that's tearing their very city down that they were elected and put in that office to defend and to better. Now, I'm off my pop crate, but I'm telling you it affects me. It affects me. But you know the bad thing about it is it doesn't always affect me the right way. It doesn't always move me the way that it ought to move me. There is such a thing as righteous indignation, but may we not confuse righteous indignation with venting our frustrations. And when I look at this portion of Scripture, and I'm not here to condone the open looting and the lawlessness of our society. I think something must be done. I think there's some just things that must be done. I think there's some necessary things that must be done. I think there's some difficult and drastic things that need to be done and need to be done now. I believe that. But I began to think about this, and I told my wife, I said, this is going to be a hard message for me this morning. Not because it's going to be hard for me to preach, but it's going to be hard for me to live. Now, I don't know, you may never stood where I stand, but sometimes this is easy preaching and it's tough living. You think, well, preacher, you're just telling us something. No, I'm preaching it to me. But I'm going to have a difficult time with what I'm getting ready to preach on, not because the content is wrong, not because it's out of context, but because of what it's going to require from me as a born-again child of God. I begin to think, how would Christ respond if He were here today? What would Jesus say if He were here today? How would He act if He were here today? Now, by the way, we know from our Bible that Jesus did get angry. We know that Jesus got angry. We know that Jesus stood up for righteousness. We know that Jesus stood up against that wicked Pharisaical crowd that was steering people the wrong way. We knew that He cast them out of the temple and overturned their tables. Don't misconstrue that Jesus would just be blindly walking through life with no care in the world for what happened to this world. But how would He respond? Would He get on social media? Now I'm being facetious, but would He get on social media and rant about everything? Would He get on social media and trash this one and trash that one and trash the other? Would He do that? Would he be known to be a rebel rouser and a fearmonger? Would He be known to do that? How would Jesus act? How would He respond? What would he think about all this unrest if he was here? Well, notice the type of people back in Matthew chapter number 9. I know my introduction was a little long, but notice the type of people back in Matthew chapter number 9 that Jesus was dealing with, and most of the time he was dealing with this type of people through his whole ministry. Through his whole ministry. He was dealing with people who were dying. First part of Matthew chapter number 9. You know what he encountered? He encountered someone that had died, and someone was asking Jesus to do something about it. He encountered dying people. He encountered sick people. Well, they might not have been dying, but they were sick. They had problems. You see, he was going places healing people. He was dealing with sick people. He was dealing with dying people. He was dealing with blind people. People who couldn't see. Hey, we can make application today. There's people who have been blinded by society and whom the God of this world has blinded the eyes of them which believe not. He was dealing with blind people. He was dealing with demonic people. Read Matthew 9. He was dealing with demonic people. People who are controlled and possessed by Satan himself and by the demons of hell. He was controlled, or he was dealing with people who are controlled in a demonic fashion. Let me tell you something. We're dealing with some demonic ideals in our society. Some godless, wicked ideals in society today. That's the type of people Jesus was dealing with. Same type of people. You say, preacher, what are you talking about? He was dealing with people who were hurting. He was dealing with, listen to this, sinners. You can put them in any category you want to put them. Murderers, killers, robbers, looters, corrupt police officers. Put them wherever you want to put them. The bottom line is he was dealing with sinners. You know what we're dealing with today? Sinners. Sinners. Hey, by the way, he was dealing with another crowd too. He was dealing with that crowd of Pharisees. You know what that crowd of Pharisees were doing? They were stirring them up to be anti-Christ. They were stirring the people up to get rid of Christ and to get Jesus out of their society. They didn't want Him to there. Can I tell you something? There's still a crowd of people that's stirring the multitude and the masses up because they want nothing to do with Jesus nor His gospel. He was dealing with it then. He was dealing with it then. Notice what Jesus said about these people. Man, this is a profound statement. The Bible said when He saw the multitudes, He was moved with compassion on them because they fainted and were scattered abroad as sheep having no shepherd. As sheep having no shepherd. Now when He saw those that were hurting, those that were dying, those that were sick, those that were demonic, when He saw their desperation, the Bible said that He saw them, but He saw them in a certain fashion. He saw them as sheep having no shepherd. Here's what it makes me think of. It makes me think about just sheep just running wild, doing what they want to. Makes me think about a lawless attitude. They were so focused on fending for themselves and putting themselves first. They were so focused on their survival, what was best for them. Makes me think about that. Makes me think about sheep that would oftentimes go and maybe put themselves in harm's way, go into places that they can't get out of. You can read all kind of things. I'm not a shepherd, obviously. That's not bad. I've got a cousin that is a shepherd. He raises sheep. That's what they do. He had a cattle farm and he started raising sheep. But they tell me there's all kind of different things that sheep do. You know, sheep are never been known to be the smartest of animals. You know, they can put themselves in situations that they, without a shepherd, can't get out of. And can I tell you, we're dealing with a society of people today who are living as sheep, having no shepherd, and they're in a situation that in and of themselves they can't get out of. And when Jesus saw this crowd of dying, hurting, sick, blind, demonic people, you know what He saw? He saw them as sheep, having no shepherd. How do we see them? I see them as thugs, troublemakers, looters, menaces to our society, disgraces upon our country. That's how I see them. But Jesus saw them as sheep, having no shepherd. You see, He recognized the biggest problem they had was that they didn't have a shepherd. That's the biggest problem. It's amazing to me how Jesus can make an impact on a life. I've heard stories where I've met people where Jesus has took a drunkard, turned him into one of the godliest Christians that's ever walked. How Jesus has took an adulterer and saved him and changed their life and turned them into a good dad and a good husband. How Jesus has took a dope addict, one that's locked up in prison, and changed their life from the inside. I'm not talking about a convenient religious to get out of trouble. I'm talking about when they had a shepherd. Man, the shepherd made a difference. It's amazing how that Jesus can take a backslid church member, somebody that's been in church their whole life, but are a Pharisee and a hypocrite, and yet when they meet Jesus, when they finally have a shepherd, He changes their life. When He saw them as sheep having no shepherd. So I got to ask myself a question, study it. Can a sheep live without a shepherd? Can a sheep live without a shepherd? Because I was working this in my mind and I thought, man, they can't live without a shepherd. They can't make without a shepherd. But the reality is, yes, a sheep can live without a shepherd. There's certain sheep that go through their whole life and never have a shepherd. They're wild sheep. And they can live without a shepherd. And I begin to think, well, what kind of analogy, Lord, is that? What kind of, I mean, yes, they can live without a shepherd. But to say they don't need a shepherd is a far cry. Let me give you, there's a difference between a wild sheep and a domesticated sheep. There's a difference. Back where I'm from, there was, and they say it's dead now, but there's something that was called the Powell's Mountain Goat. Powell's Mountain was a mountain between two cities. Well, not cities, between two towns. We don't really have cities. I think there's two in the whole state. And one of them really is sketchy. But it's this mountain between two towns, and they could look up, and there was this wild goat. He lived for a long time. They don't know really where he come from. They don't know how he sustained himself. But every night I saw him one time. One time I saw him. Nobody fed him. He wasn't a pet. He was a wild goat. Made it his whole life. So what then is the difference between a wild sheep and a domesticated sheep? Well, the difference would be the kind of life in which they live. Boy, this helps me. You see, a wild sheep is responsible for fending for themselves, making sure they have something to eat, making sure they keep themselves out of danger. But a domesticated sheep don't have to worry about none of that. You see, a wild sheep, they're on their own life, living their own way. Listen, oftentimes they have a lot of danger, they have a lot of heartache, they have a lot of sickness. They're in danger of other wild animals, and it's all their responsibility. But a domesticated sheep, he's just got to follow the voice of the shepherd. It's the shepherd that worries about where he's going to get his next meal. It's the shepherd that worries about where he's going to lay down. It's the shepherd. Hey, listen, a wild sheep, I'm telling you, if you'll get a hold of what I'm saying and what Jesus is saying here about a sheep having no shepherd, hey, you wonder why they run wild. It's because they have no shepherd. But can I tell you, for those of us that's been saved by the marvelous grace of God, and we have a shepherd, I know that I have a shepherd that sustains me. I know that I have a shepherd that protects me. I know that I have a shepherd that'll guide me. What's the difference between a wild sheep and a domesticated sheep? The shepherd. And it's a type of lifestyle in which they live. That wild sheep, you know what they have to do? They have to defend themselves. Something comes, not a domesticated sheep. There's somebody bigger than them fighting their battles. Oh, aren't you glad if you're saved by the grace of God? Hey, there's somebody bigger than us fighting our battles. Hey, aren't you glad if you know Jesus Christ as your shepherd? Hey, David said, the Lord is my shepherd. But he said when he saw them, he saw them as sheep having no shepherd. A life in which the shepherd is responsible to provide the food. A life in which the shepherd is taking out on the responsibility to defend. A life in which the shepherd will take time to do the shearing when necessary. And a life in which the shepherd will pull the sheep out of danger. The shepherd can do for the sheep what the sheep can't do for themselves. Can I tell you this morning, for those of us who are saved, hey, we have a shepherd that can do for us what we can't do for ourselves. And when we look at this world and we look at the direction this world is going, you say, preacher, what do they need more than anything? They need programs and social reform. No, they need the shepherd. They need the shepherd. How did Jesus respond when He looked at these lost sheep? Oftentimes the disciples looked at things differently than Jesus did. Remember when they sent the children away? Because they was afraid He's going to bother the master. And Jesus said, suffer the little children to come unto me. They had the wrong perspective. They didn't look at things through the same eyes as Christ did. Let's look at a few things this morning that Jesus teaches us about looking at and living with lost sheep. First of all, Jesus' priority and perspective is found in verse number 35. Verse number 35. My introduction was longer than my message, so you can relax a little bit. In verse number 35, the Bible said, and Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and preaching the gospel of the kingdom and healing every sickness and every disease among the people. What was Jesus' priority? What was the priority of Jesus Christ? What was it? Well, let me tell you what it was not. It was not to change the political views nor the climate of society. Now there was coming a day, and there is coming a day, thanks be unto the Lord, that He is going to change the political views and the climate of our society. Well, there is coming a day when King Jesus is going to return and He'll rule and reign with a rod of iron. There's coming a day when He'll put down sin and deal with it immediately. There is coming a day, but that's not why Jesus came the first time. That's not why He came the first time. He did not come. The Bible teaches us that Jesus told Mary and Joseph, "Wist ye not that I must be about my Father's business?" It was not the Father's business for Jesus to set up His kingdom at this time. That's not what the Father's business. The Father's business was that He would come to seek and to save that which was lost. Those lost sheep, those sheep who had no shepherd. That was the Father's business. His perspective, His priority was not to change the political views and climate of society. Now let me say this. There's nothing wrong with being an active, concerned, and an involved citizen. There's nothing wrong with that. Don't leave here saying, preacher saying, close your eyes, put your head in the sand, and go about just happy in Jesus and do nothing to impact or make a difference in our society. Farthest from the truth, we're supposed to impact the world in which we live. And let me tell you something, social reform is not the primary purpose and the primary perspective that we ought to have in our Christian walk. You say, why is that? Because we live in an ungodly society. We live in a nation that, among people, sinners who have openly forsaken and rejected Jesus Christ. Let me put it this way. You'll beat your head against the wall if you're never satisfied unless you fix everything. You're not going to accomplish it. You're not going to be able to do that. All right, so there's nothing wrong with being involved, but we must guard against becoming engulfed. And this is our primary focus and objective. You know, we sing the song, "This world is not my home." Maybe we ought to start living like we're part of a different country. Again, I'm not talking about forsaking America. Don't misunderstand me. Our country was founded upon the principles of the Scriptures. I'm not talking about walking away from our heritage and not taking a stand for our right. Don't misunderstand any of that. But that must not be our primary goal, is to fix this country. You see, these sheep are lost, and these sheep need a shepherd. Who's going to tell them about the shepherd if the church don't? Who's going to testify? Who's going to testify of the life-changing ability of the shepherd if those of us who are His sheep don't testify of that? It's going to be hard for me to testify of the great life it is to live in the shepherd when I'm living a life of those wild sheep who know not the shepherd. It's going to be hard for me to convince them of that, isn't it? You see, too many times people of His fold are trying to live like they're of that fold. His primary focus was not to change the political atmosphere of His country. Second of all, I see His priority, look at this, was people. You know, some of the most aggravating people are people. They are. People are aggravating. Now, y'all love Jesus, and I know you never get upset. Has anybody ever been aggravated at a person? Say, preacher, we're looking at it. Maybe. People are aggravating. Anybody ever argue with somebody who just argues to argue? Anybody ever been one of those people who just argue to argue? And if you think you're right, man, see, people are aggravating. But sometimes I think that we lose sight on the fact that these people that are rioting and looting, some of these corrupt police officers are doing things, they're still people. They're still people. And not only they're people, but they're people that Jesus Christ died for. And they're people whom Jesus desires to be their shepherd. But they're also people, they're also people that if Jesus becomes their shepherd, He will change their living from a wild sheep to a domesticated sheep. Preacher, what do we need to do? We need to keep our mind and our priority and our focus on the fact that the bottom line is they're sinners who need a shepherd. Now, I told you earlier that this is an easy message to preach, but man, it's hard to live. You know why? Because when I get aggravated and I get angry, I want justice. But sometimes my justice is not justice at all. Sometimes my justice looks more like revenge. Now, y'all may not struggle with that, but sometimes I do. Sometimes I don't want justice. I don't want them to go before a court system. I'm looking for a lynching, which, by the way, that's what they're looking for. You can call it what you want. They don't want justice. They want a lynch mob. That's what they have, riding in the streets, burning down cities, threatening to do the same thing to every police officer because they wear a badge, don't care about where they come from, don't care about their children or their family. They just want to lynch them. That's not justice, my friend. That's vengeance. Sometimes I can be the same way. Now, I call it justice because that way I feel better about myself. But the bottom line is they're people. They're people that Jesus Christ died for. He didn't come to change their political agenda. His priority was people. His ministry was preaching and teaching. Notice Jesus did this publicly in the synagogues, but He did it privately in the streets. He was preaching and He was teaching. Would to the Lord that our churches would get back to preaching and teaching. Preaching and teaching. You say, preacher, what do you mean? Listen, I'm not against social programs. As a matter of fact, I think we ought to do more in the church to get in our community. I read a post, some preacher, I think it was a preacher that made this post. Is our church essential enough that if we weren't in our community, would it even make a difference in our community? It's a pretty powerful statement, church. Are we essential enough that we make a difference whether we're here or not? We should. We should. But how are we going to do that? We're going to have to get back to preaching and teaching. We're going to have to get back to showing people they need a shepherd. We're going to have to get back to preaching the truth of Jesus Christ. But listen, if I'm going to preach it with my mouth, I better preach it with my life. If Jesus made that much a difference in my life, they ought to be able to see it at the Walmart just as much as they ought to have in the parking lot of the house of God. They ought to see it in the way I act, the way I live, the way I talk, the way I think, the way I operate. They ought to be able to see that. Why? Because I've got a shepherd. You know what Jesus' focus was? His ministry was preaching and teaching. They're different words. They're different words. Teaching is on an intimate, where he teaches and he explains. Preaching is proclaiming. You know what he was preaching? He was preaching the gospel of the kingdom. He was telling them that there's coming a day that Messiah is going to come and rule and reign. That's the gospel of the kingdom. He was telling them about a day that Jesus was going to come back. He was telling them about a day that society was going to be better. He was telling them about a day where there'd be no more sickness, heartache, sorrow. Hey, may I tell you, listen, I'm not looking for the kingdom as of yet. I'm looking for the rapture. I'm looking for the city whose builder and maker is God. You know what our world needs? They need the gospel of Jesus Christ. They need the gospel of Jesus Christ. They need to know that Jesus Christ, the good shepherd, giveth His life for the sheep. They need to know that Jesus, the sinless, spotless Lamb of God, came and took upon Himself the form of a servant, lived a sinless life for some 33 and a half years as the divine Son of God, and went to Calvary and paid a sin debt that He did not owe. He paid a price for my sin. He paid a price for your sin. He paid a price for their sin. And He went to Calvary and He drew His last breath of His own free will, and He laid down His life as a sacrifice for mankind. In 3 days, He got up victorious over death, hell, and the grave. And I'm telling you, listen, He's coming back. He's going to receive those that are His up in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord. Our world needs to know the truth of the gospel. Listen, handouts only last so long. Stimulus checks only go so far. Social programs only do so much good. But without Jesus Christ, they're still as a sheep that have no shepherd. Who's going to tell them about the shepherd, church? We must tell them about the shepherd. We're going to have to get back to preaching, teaching, and living like we know the shepherd. See Jesus' priority. Then I see this word moved in verse number 36. Jesus was moved. You know, sometimes we're moved, aren't we? Sometimes we're moved. You say, preacher, you sound like you were pretty moved earlier. Yeah, we're moved with anger. We can be moved with anger. Sometimes we're moved to fear. Isn't it amazing how we're controlled? Isn't it amazing how we're controlled? Let me just give you something to think about. Y'all still okay, aren't you? Let me give you something to think about. How come it's safe to go down and protest and burn up cities and we're not worried about the coronavirus down there? But I can't have 50 in the house of God? It's okay for thousands to storm the streets with the political leaders of that city. Why is it okay now? Let me tell you why. Public agenda. You can say what you want to. You can say, preacher, I don't like that. That makes me mad. I'm not trying to upset you. I'm trying to get you to think. We're being programmed. Fearmonger, man, it's pushed among the people. Listen, church, be careful. Because if we're not careful, we can be moved, but we can be moved the wrong way. I told you it's going to be easy for me to preach, but it's going to be difficult for me to live. Because I'm going to have to make my focus intentionally what Jesus' focus was. Move with anger, move with fear, move with disgust. Now, again, nothing wrong with a lot of these things. Moved to hate, moved to bitterness, moved to division. You fill in the blank. All kind of emotions that go through our mind, isn't there? We can be moved. But the Bible says that Jesus was moved with compassion. Do you realize that nobody has ever committed an ill or a wrong against me like they committed against Jesus? Nobody's ever done me wrong like they did Jesus wrong. Nobody's ever done that. Nobody's ever crucified me. Nobody's ever mocked me in the fashion in which they did Jesus and rejected me as the person. Nobody's ever done that, but they did it to Jesus. Yet Jesus, when He saw them, He was moved with compassion. From the very bowels of pity and love is what that word means. He was moved. It was genuine. When Jesus looked and was moved with compassion, it wasn't fake piety. It wasn't a fake piety. It wasn't a piousness that, well, everybody expects me to say this, so that's what I'm going to say. No, it was genuine from the depths of His heart and the depths of His soul. That's how Jesus was moved. But man, we're moved in every other way. Usually compassion is the furthest down on my list. I really hate to admit that, but I'm telling you, my flesh and my humanity, usually compassion in this situation is the furthest down on my list. How many have ever made this statement? They got it coming to them. You ever heard it? Be honest. I won't ask you, you ever said it? Now, in reality, they do have some things coming. Told you, if you don't want to get a speeding ticket, stop speeding. I hope I don't get one on the way out of here. Stop speeding. Now, let me just say it this way. Jesus was moved with compassion. Jesus Christ did not condone nor approve of their lifestyles and conditions. Don't misinterpret His moving with compassion to say, well, it's okay, and pat them on the head and say, well, they're fine, they can't help it. That's not the way Jesus operated. That's not the way He operated. Jesus did not desire that they continue to follow the Pharisees' false teaching and deception. As a matter of fact, He taught and preached that to them. However, Jesus saw them for who they were, and it moved in compassion. He said, they don't have a shepherd. They're a bunch of wild sheep. They're just fending for themselves. They need a shepherd. May it affect our eyes when we look at this crowd and just say, you know, the greatest thing that this world needs is they need a shepherd. And I know Him. And if you're saved, you know Him. But what are we doing to tell them about the shepherd? One of the things also important to note, and I'll give you my last thought. According to verse number 36, Jesus was moved because of the multitudes, not by the multitudes. There's a difference. I'm going to say that one more time. According to verse number 36, He said He was moved with compassion on them. You see that word? Because. Because. He was moved because of the multitudes, not by the multitudes. In other words, the actions and the behavior or the condition of the multitude did not alter the character and the behavior of our Savior. Are you listening to me this morning? Well, I act that way because they acted that way. The multitude did not alter the character or the behavior of our Savior. Why is it that we as Christians, let me tell you why. Because oftentimes we act according to our flesh rather than acting the way Jesus acted. You see, we're affected and we're impacted by the multitude rather than because of the multitude. You see, we fail to see them as sinners. We fail to see them as a godless crowd. You see, preacher, they're hateful and they're mean and they despise God and everything that's good about God. And you're exactly right. But the bottom line is they need a shepherd. They need a shepherd. And whether you and I like to admit it or not, we were just as lost as they are before we got saved. We were headed to the same hell as they are before we met the shepherd. Are you hearing me this morning? I'm telling you, Jesus was moved. But Jesus used this occasion to teach and to send His disciples. And here's where I think we need to get a hold of this church. The Bible said that Jesus was teaching and preaching, and He was going from city to city and town to town. He was preaching the gospel of the kingdom. And then He saw the multitudes, and He was moved with compassion because they were sheep, having no shepherd. Then saith He, verse 37, to His disciples, the harvest truly is plenteous, but the laborers are few. Pray ye therefore the Lord of the harvest, that He would send forth laborers into His harvest. A couple things we can learn from this. He teaches them and shows them the enormity of the task. There's a lot of lost people in this world that need a shepherd. Jesus compares it to a harvest. You know, we live in some farm country. There's some farmland here. You ever drove out in the land? If you ever go kind of out west and you see those big fields, and I mean it's just acres and acres and acres and acres and acres. Can you imagine having to do that by hand before they invented a John Deere or Massey Ferguson? That would have been overwhelming to start. You say, what is that? It shows us the enormity. Listen, church, there's a big world that needs a shepherd. There's a big world out there who needs a shepherd, and it's a large task. And Jesus said, pray ye the Lord of the harvest that He'll send forth laborers into His harvest. The size of the field, the shortage of workers, He tells us that. Christian, it's time that you and I wake up and understand that God called us to be a worker. And there's a shortage of worker. And there is no room to afford laziness or slacking off. We must be about our Father's business. Because there's a world that needs a shepherd. It tells them to pray for more workers. There's another passage where Jesus teaches of the harvest in John 4. And Jesus tells His disciples to look unto the field. For they are white, all ready to harvest. Don't get sidetracked with other things, child of God. Don't lose sight of why we're here. And don't lose sight of who we are. Oh, I'm not here to be a champion of a social cause. I'm here because I know a shepherd, and my shepherd wants to be their shepherd. And I have the truth of the gospel. May I stay focused on sharing the gospel with people who need a shepherd. May you and I, as God's people, behave in such a fashion that we can see them as people. Yes, sinful people. Yes, wicked people. Yes, people who need God, but people nonetheless. People whom Jesus loved and Jesus went to Calvary for, and people that Jesus died for. May we ever be mindful that they're people. He's not only telling us to pray that God would send, but in the very next chapter, you know what He tells them in chapter number 10? He gets those same disciples together and said, now here's what I want you to do. I want you to go. I want you to pray that God sends somebody. A lot of us, we're good with chapter number 9, verse 37 and verse number 38. It's when we come to chapter number 10, the first few verses of that one, He said, now you go. I'm good with God sending missionaries to Africa. I'm good with God sending missionaries to Asia. God sending them to Mexico, China, all across the world. But what about God tells me to go? You say, why? Because God expects me to make a difference in the harvest. Because there's sheep everywhere who need a shepherd. I hope this message will challenge us that as we look and live with lost sheep, that we can look and live at these lost sheep the way Jesus did. As sheep having no shepherd. And you and I will get a burden to take the gospel and to share. You say, preacher, well, they don't want to hear it. That's between them and God. That's between them and the Lord. They need to hear the message. They need to know. Because let me tell you something. In the midst of all that chaos and crowd, there are people who are hurting. And there are people who are dying. And there are people who, because maybe they're looking, maybe they're longing for something greater than what they got. Tell them about the shepherd. If you're here this morning and you're the same way, you say, preacher, I'm living a life, I'm just like a lost sheep and I need the shepherd. I want you to know something. The same Jesus that saved my soul is the same Jesus that can save your soul. Because that's why He went to Calvary, to save that which was lost. Looking and living with lost sheep, may we always look at them the same way Jesus looked at them, as sheep having no shepherd. And may our ministry be about telling them about the shepherd. Would you stand with me this morning?